Good morning and welcome to the Digital Desk. I'm your host, Sarah Good. Today we're going to be talking about the possible TikTok ban that could take place. Congress is supposed to see a bill tomorrow that could ultimately ban the app in the United States. Now they're saying it's due to privacy concerns, and they're asking, TikTok, to the parent company ByteDance, to divest from, asking TikTok to divest from ByteDance in order to sort of protect data. Anyway, so today we're going to be talking with an ODU Associate Professor, Miles McNutt, Dr. Miles McNutt from Old Dominion University, Communications and Theater, about what this means about the app in general. So put any questions that you have on the Facebook chat, and if you're watching on WAVY.com, please view the link, view the bill in question, and more. Miles, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about this.
Thank you for having me.
And look, I'm sure you've seen this pop up now over a course of a couple years, including in Virginia. There was a proposed ban for, youth, in order to use the app. But I guess in this iteration of possibly banning the bill, what were your first thoughts?
I mean, this is not a new conversation. This is a conversation I've been having with my students for a while now. I actually have my students make TikToks in one of my classes, and as an exercise to talk about an app that's deeply important to contemporary culture. It's important to business. It's important to commerce. It's important to memes. Like, it's part of the fabric of particularly their generation and their lives. And I think understanding that is really critical in a course called Understanding Media. But I did have some students sort of express, well, I have a government device, right? That all of a sudden I can't use TikTok, or I'm concerned about security. And I'm like, those are all really interesting conversations that we should be having about how the app works and how it functions. Whether they're enough to justify banning it or forcing ByteDance to divest, I think is a complicated political question. And I think what we're seeing right now is this political conversation happening, which I think makes sense as to why these things are being brought up. But I think there's a disconnect between that and the lived experience of users and how they actually experience TikTok and what that looks like, that's maybe creating some of the dissonance we're seeing in the conversations around it.
Right. So part of it might be the understanding, of the actual lawmakers in terms of the daily use of the app.
Right. I mean, I think the thing to think about it is sort of like when there are concerns about like that China has all this data on Americans, it's like, well, what kind of data are we talking about? Like, what are people using TikTok for? And I think that, there are some people who might be using it to express very political, personal opinions, and you could think about potential usages. For the record, of course, there is no evidence that this has ever happened. Right? There is literally nobody can point to any evidence of China using the app for propaganda purposes or a particular security leaks coming from this. This is very much all a hypothetical concern. And I think for an average user, they're just like, oh, I saw an amazing video about a woman reuniting with their lost dog.
Right. The
I saw
everyday routine
an amazing
experience
video.
is like that.
Right. And there's something so mundane about it, but also something kind of transformative. And so I think people are kind of like, if they have my data about how many times I rewatched that video of a tear reunion between a mother and son, like, how is that possibly compromising national security? And I think the other factor that comes into this is that so many people now are using TikTok as part of their business. And like, we can talk about TikTok Shop as a necessary evil of this system. But like, I think the reality of that is that people are relying on TikTok to run their lives, to move themselves forward, and are now basically being told this entire app could be banned in the country and separated from that over sort of concerns that do not feel real to an average user, that an average user does not really understand or experience the app in terms that are political or that kind of go through that dimension. And so for that reason, I think you're seeing a lot of the pushback happening from this isn't so much that people are arguing national security isn't important. I don't think that's what's sort of going on here. I think people just don't understand how these two things are connected. And I think many of the lawmakers who are making that argument have probably never been on TikTok, right? And have probably never seen what the For You page does. And like, we should be deeply concerned about social media and algorithms and the control they have over our lives. But I feel like we can do that through education and understanding. Banning them does not really seem like the avenue towards that goal. This seems like a political fight that's kind of, I think, overshadowing and complicating a more nuanced experience of social media.
And it's interesting too because a big debate we've obviously heard in the last couple years is the mental health piece, and making sure that youth especially understand what's real, what's not. But this is not even at play there. I know that it's probably in some lawmakers' minds, but they're saying that this is separate from that, which is interesting because that's really been the debate on the forefront the last few years, is the mental health aspect and what you see.
Right. And I think the thing that there's sort of like, it's a matter of what conversation are we having and which is easier to accept. And I think that in this circumstance, politicians, they don't want to be seen as soft on national defense or on China, right? No one really wants to step up and be like, actually, I'm fine with this, don't worry about it. China has our data, not really a concern. That's a really difficult political position to hold, unless I saw Maxwell Frost was one example of a congressional representative who made that statement, but he is like the token Gen Z congressman. So of course he's going to be on the forefront of that. But I think in a lot of cases, they don't want to be that person. I think the mental health debate is more complicated because it involves questions of moderation and algorithms that we are much more nuanced than the conversation that they're currently trying to have. I also think that, again, though, it's complicated because there's no question that TikTok's algorithm research has shown will dig people deeper into their respective situations. But for every person who experiences that, there's somebody else who finds somebody who helps them connect with themselves and understand themselves better. And it's like, we shouldn't be using TikTok for therapy, but there's no question that people are like getting a better understanding of the world. There's a whole conversation about people, finding out their sort of neurodivergence or ADHD diagnoses by seeing TikToks and kind of seeing versions of themselves. The very idea of somebody understanding their identity better because TikTok, the algorithm understands them and shows them things they might not have seen otherwise. It gives them new perspective. The reality of social media, particularly one that's so algorithmically driven, is that it can pull people in so many different directions and have so many different distinct experiences that for every person who is effectively being victimized by an app, there's another person who's like, this transformed my life, this changed me. And it's like that makes it so challenging to make blanket bans and these types of statements when you're challenging everybody's experiences and sort of trying to encapsulate that. And there's no question that the bill as it stands, I think a lot of the pushback that it's getting from users from the fact that it's really not making any attempt to acknowledge the kind of multitudes of TikTok in its
Right, and all of the good that could be there. And, TikTok is saying, at least in their statement, 170 million Americans, I believe, use the app. Obviously, there's going to be variety in there. As you said, there are people, I've seen people, talk about their experience with ALS, for example. You've seen people sort of make maybe more accessible some of these things for people. I also wanted to mention a big question, from the beginning was, they were saying that in Asia, people are getting more STEM content and things that are a bit more mathematically or science focused. Here, in the US, while that might not be on your For You page if you're not looking it up and that's not in your algorithm, there is literally, if you just slide over, a whole page, a whole feed dedicated to that.
Right, and I think the reality is that, again, it's such a distinct form, and like I always try to emphasize this with my students, sort of the idea of an algorithm-based system. It's like every other social media app encourages friends and follows, right? It's primarily designed for you to control it. And the idea of the For You page is the notion that like it's doing all that work for you, that it knows you better than you know yourself. And it's like, that's terrifying, just to be very clear. It should not know us better than ourselves, and that should work. But it's the relationship that builds that forms. And so I think when people are sort of like, oh, this can be used to spread propaganda. And it's like the whole reason the app is so, connective to people, we could argue addictive, but like the reason people enjoy it so much is because everything they're seeing is something they want to see. And so the idea that those people would then be susceptible to Chinese propaganda or any kind of sort of like process, they would reject it. It wouldn't fit the algorithm. It wouldn't bring people into the app. The whole business model would be undone if China, I think, were to do what they have been, basically accused of planning to do with this trove of data and these systems. And so I think that kind of, if the app were to change in ways, like you say, that would beat against those principles, but everything's searchable. Everybody can find something if they want to, right? It's a question of, do we get into those bubbles, right? Like, does it kind of silo us in to a very narrow version? But like, that's a broader lesson of social media we should always think about. And it's not something that this bill is trying to address or really pushing us to consider. This is much more of a political statement rather than a sociocultural kind of investigation of what these apps are and how we connect with them.
Absolutely. And then there was an example they gave, I think back in 2020, they sold the famous, dating app Grindr because they were worried about foreign influence and the data as well. I don't even believe at that point, to my knowledge, I don't know, if there was a big example of that. But again, they forced the sale of that. And then now you also worry about, I think a good point was brought up this week about, well, what about the other apps? What about Facebook and Twitter and Instagram that have been traditionally used for, places where other countries can put out, propaganda and sort of infiltrate maybe our election system?
Well, I mean, the reality is that in some ways, like because of how TikTok is organized, I think people would reject it much faster, right? As I sort of indicated, right? I think when things come up on Facebook, we're kind of used to random things coming up through our Facebook feeds as kind of part of the appeal at this point, right? Of just kind of like we're just seeing what's going on. I think obviously it was something like Twitter, things get retweeted, sponsored posts into page. The mess of Twitter right now is beyond the scope of this conversation. And I'm just going to keep calling it Twitter. But like, think about TikTok. I think that we need to sort of engage with is like, I think any efforts to actively use it in that way, the sort of like a claim of psyops, like all these different things that could happen. I think users would reject it in full. I think the algorithm's built to kind of be like, well, they didn't like that, or they weren't paying attention to that. And so it's like, and again, if this were part of a conversation about addressing those concerns across all platforms, right? If we were really going back to what happened with Analytica, what happened sort of with Russian propaganda during the 2016 election, if that's the conversation we were having, I think we're certainly open to thinking about those questions. I think the idea of a ban on security reasons just doesn't really have a grounding in the reality of these apps and kind of where the security concerns rest.
I have to say, I just was looking at the Facebook comments just to see, what people were thinking. And, some of these conversations, especially when you're talking about politics, either get negative or, one-sided. But I think in this case, at least in the chat, most people are pro TikTok and, are pro using it. And as you said, the swipe up motion is much easier on TikTok to sort of get off something that you don't want to see versus on Instagram, you have to click the dots. You have to say that it's something that you'd rather not see. Same goes for ads on YouTube or Facebook. You have to sort of manually manipulate what you don't want to see, but it's basically done for you in this version.
Yeah, I mean, like the thing that I think about TikTok all the time. So I have a kind of rule for myself in using the app because I wasn't on the app at all until I started teaching with it, and I kind of decided I have to be on it, and that was like a bad life choice if we're really being honest about it. But I'm there now, and that's what's going to happen. And what I think is so interesting is like I made a conscious choice. I wasn't going to follow people, right? Like I didn't want to use it that way. I wanted to let the algorithm sort of figure itself out in terms of how it organizes it. And I also was like, I'm not going to like things. I'm going to just let my movements, right, see how that plays out. And it's like I ended up with a feed that, feels catered to my interests, that, follows the things. And like that's a fairly diverse set of things. As a researcher, I'm definitely like interested in a very wide range of ideas. And there's no question that like, yeah, a simple swipe can indicate that you're not interested in something or that something's not connecting with you. And so I think when people talk about the potential risks of being on the app and what that looks like, I think the app, it would break itself. Like TikTok would die if it actually did these things that it's being accused of. And simply because I think users would stop connecting with it and stop engaging with it. And again, I don't want to in any way suggest that the market is capable of correcting anything because capitalism doesn't work that way. But I do think that there's no question that the way the app is connecting with users is so predicated on it resonating with them that anything that would dramatically change that, I think, would be a point of rejection to the point where I think even political content, like you say, can be so divisive. I think that any attempt to sort of like flood the field with explicit politics, I think would create a lot of pushback from people who very much view TikTok as an escape from that discourse that you see so often across other social platforms.
Right. And not to get too technical, but I did want to say, you pointed out, of course, there hasn't been an example of this happening. Also, there are other ways to get data in the United States or other countries to get our data or see data via other apps and other softwares. This is not a lone TikTok example happening here. It's just sort of, I don't know if it's being used as an example or it's the one that's most in the mainstream that's being looked at, but there are other ways in the United States where data questions do come up.
Right. If we wanted to talk about how secure our data is in general, like that's a much larger conversation that has to do with all the choices we make, our buying power, all those different elements. I think there's no question that it's the China factor, right? That's the only reason that TikTok is being treated differently than the other apps in this circumstance is that these security concerns that happen across all apps. This is not a TikTok conversation exclusively, are part of that. I do think the algorithmic nature is also an element of it, though. The idea being that people's use of the app is so dependent on this system. And one of the things we need to remember about algorithms is that they're not like neutral systems, right? Somebody made these algorithms. These algorithms are designed to serve a purpose. And the fact that they're being designed by the Chinese owners of these apps, I can understand like where that reads as a concern if you've never been on TikTok. And I think we should still be considerate of it in general. But I do think that the reality of that algorithm, like I said, is that if you actually programmed it to do these things, it would no longer get valuable data because people are using the app. And I think that that's kind of where that maybe disconnect comes in, that we sort of, start that conversation.
And I did want to go back to something you were talking about. You're talking about business owners for a second. You were talking about some of these companies that, utilize it. There's creators and influencers and people that have built really million-dollar businesses off of this. Where do they go? I guess that would be a question. Do they go? There's no app like it. So, the algorithm for TikTok and how their business was grown is not going to function the exact same way. They would have to adapt.
No. And I think this is sort of like, this is not the first time that would happen. Obviously, we saw people, Vine, when Vine died, they had a whole creator infrastructure, RIP Vine, that really kind of brought those, people, and they had to figure out, okay, I need to go to YouTube or Instagram. Those are different platforms doing different things. How do I manage that? We see a similar thing this way. I have seen some creators start to promote their YouTube channels more often as part of their accounts. I follow an account. I don't actually follow anything. I only follow NHL mascot Gritty on TikTok, for the record. But I see videos by Jose Monkey, who is a guy who basically finds people. They post a video of them in a random location that's without clear markers, and he like uses data mining and hunches to sort of figure out exactly where they were located somewhere in the world. And it's very much a TikTok format, bite-sized videos, right? Kind of engaging format, gets your attention. But he started to promote his YouTube channel because he specifically said TikTok might not be here anymore. People are going to ban this who don't understand how it works. So I need a backup plan if I want to continue doing this and selling merch and kind of building out that idea. I think for creators, the creator economy has always existed on YouTube, depending on what you're doing. But I think a lot of what has become connected on TikTok are very particular forms of engagement and creativity that are built on kind of the intimacy, the parasocial connection that creates, the feeling like we're almost getting a FaceTime call with some of these people. And I think that to format that into YouTube or Instagram Reels or those types of systems just doesn't have the same community attached to it, the same dynamics. Every other app has tried to copy what TikTok is doing, such that you could just take a TikTok and put it on YouTube Shorts or Instagram Reels. But there's something about the way the algorithm kind of connects people together and that people view the app that I think would be missing. And I don't think that's going to be a persuasive argument to people making security concern arguments, because they're just going to be like, they just go somewhere else. There's all sorts of other apps. But I think that the specificity of TikTok is something that people and users recognize and engage with, that I do think that is really something that clearly lawmakers don't understand and is going to be sort of part of the tension happening here.
And I was going to say too, to your point, the interactivity, you could write a comment, I could write a comment on your video, and you could directly make a video just on that comment alone. So, I mean, there's just this sort of ever-ending cycle, really, that could go on with conversation or, offshoots of conversations.
Yeah, I mean, so I had one viral TikTok in my time using the app, which is not, I don't make a lot of TikToks, but I made a TikTok about asking for reference letters of college professors, because I'm like, look, this should not be that complicated. I saw a video, I stitched that video, stitching, of course, very particular to TikTok, doing a direct follow-up, being able to continue a conversation. And I get so many people in the comments of my video kind of being like, okay, but what if this is my situation, right? How do I do this? How do I ask this question? And so I just sat down in my living room and just recorded a bunch of replies directly to people, where it's like, hey, you're struggling to ask a professor because you've been out of school for a few years. Let's talk about how you should do that, right? How do I want to receive an email in that situation? That they had access to an expert in this case of what we were talking about, that could just provide additional context, address questions directly, and engage in those practices. And like you can do that in other social platforms. But TikTok, you're right. The way things play out is just part of that community. It's part of that conversation. Like every time I see a video in my feed and the next day get a part two, or I get a follow up, or I get a reply to it, and I see things play out, it's like I'm seeing a story play out, right? I'm part of a conversation. I'm part of this dialogue. There's a very distinct set of pleasures attached to that, that even if we don't think about the educational function, about the mental health function in a positive way or a negative way, but there's just something about the app that does kind of hit those kind of dopamine registers in terms of how I think we relate to it and connect with it. And I think that that's, without being on TikTok, you don't know, right? I don't think if you see a TikTok on Instagram Reels, you don't know what it was like to experience it in its original form. And I think that, again, I don't think any of that's going to resonate with the people who are trying to ban the app. I think it's very clear at this point that there's a clear political line in the sand that's being drawn. But I do think that the actual lived experience of users is always going to be in disconnect from this conversation.
Right. And, we've seen now, I guess Twitter is the massive one, right? We've seen how that worked, sort of going from its original owners. But, in the case of this, there has been some interest, at least, online, or sources say that some people are maybe willing to purchase it if it came to that. And then there would be only about 5.5 months, if this bill is passed, really, for TikTok to separate from that, Chinese-based company and sort of move around. But you never know what that process is going to do to the app as well.
Right. And I think ultimately, I think people like to equate this with a ban, and it's like it's technically a divestment request. They're just trying to basically separate this from the China conversation so that the app, which, like, again, all major brands are on TikTok, right? The US capital, infrastructure is all deeply embedded within this app in a very functional way, such that there's no question that, like, I don't think the government literally wants to get rid of TikTok. I think they simply want to have it without needing to deal with the complexity of the China conversation and the security concerns therein. If another company comes in, as you said, we saw with Twitter, we don't know what that looks like. I do think that the hope would be in this case that if we are seeing a company take over, that they would be slightly less likely to sort of make dramatic changes.
Right, supporting TikTok, but not taking the TikTok itself over.
Right. Because I think ultimately their goal would simply be to keep the thing running, right? It's working, it's kind of building those systems. But yeah, if a billionaire were to step in and kind of run it as their own fiefdom, you have no idea what happens to these platforms. I think there's a very sort of limited capacity. And so, again, I think I don't want to give the impression that I'm taking the concerns around TikTok and security lightly. I don't think it's something we shouldn't be considering. I think it's a matter of, if we want to talk about the issues of social media and potential risks to users, I think we should be having a very much more complicated conversation that should be happening across all apps. I think singling out TikTok for just this reason is maybe giving people a false understanding of whether there are security concerns with other apps as well, and what we should really be thinking about, and what kind of data we should be sharing.
Quickly, just based off what you said, I just wanted to reiterate your point that it's not technically a ban. However, it will be, you'll have a significant fine. It'll be banned from the app stores. If you yourself use it, you can be fined. And then I think they calculated for Apple and maybe for, Samsung and for these companies, it would be 850 million or so in fines. So definitely probably a risk they don't want to take at that point. So a ban is effective and what would happen.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think the way obviously, they're trying to get around the constitutionality of actually banning it, which I think they understand they really reasonably cannot do. Realistically, they don't want to actually ban it. They just want them to divest it. Right? That's a threat, right? It's just kind of to create the circumstance that they want, which is for them no longer to be owners and for TikTok to just exist as a separate entity. That was what was close during the Trump administration when the executive order came down. I saw, of course, this morning that Trump is now against a ban, which is a new added wrinkle to this conversation that we'll see how that plays out, given how that has impacted legislation over the past couple months. But that's kind of a new dimension that we'll see play out.
It was interesting because Biden, during the Super Bowl, I believe, made his account on TikTok to reach that demographic. And I think, we've seen that Trump and some of the MAGA content does really well on the app with the demographic. So obviously you never know what's at play here, but.
Well, that's the thing is like realistically, we're talking about an app where I think if they grasped and understood how to use it, and I think, there's been plenty of politicians who've used TikTok very successfully, right? In ways that kind of demonstrate, hey, there's potential to reach young people and get them engaged in politics, et cetera. But I also think you also have so little control over it, and the reach of your videos and how those things play out, that I think it's just an unknown. And I think unknowns can be scary. And so, yeah, I think we'll see where this lands to understand what role it will play in the coming election.
And I just want to ask last thing. Sorry for taking so much of your time, but
No, please.
it's so interesting to talk about. What would you say to the people on the panel, I guess? What would be your biggest advice, if we had a magic microphone to be able to talk to them? But would it be using it, making this, in Congress, whether we're talking about TikTok or whether we're talking about Twitter or Facebook, but understanding what actually the software is on a personal level?
I mean, the simple truth is that, and I say this not in an effort to shame them for this fact at all, but like the average age of a person in Congress is simply not going to connect them with this. This isn't their culture, right? And I don't think it needs to be, right? Not everybody needs to be on social media or engage with that. But I think that there is a responsibility when you think about how central these apps are to people's lives, their livelihoods, their experiences. I think particularly coming out of the pandemic, these social media platforms were actually a central way that we connected to the world and felt those things happening that we've seen, in many ways. I think the challenge of TikTok is everybody's TikTok is so different, right? Like anybody who joined TikTok in 2020 likely has a much more political TikTok than people who joined after, because they joined in the summer of Black Lives Matter. They joined in the environment of the 2020 election where that kind of defined their engagement with it. Other people who joined before that, maybe it's mostly dance content, but like everybody has their connection to it. And I think you need to hear those stories. You need to talk to those people. You need to get an understanding of how that is happening. And I think that ultimately there needs to be sort of an understanding that whatever conversation we're having about TikTok cannot just be being had about TikTok, or else we're really not having the conversation we need to be having, right? Like if they want to talk about bans and around these issues and these alleged concerns, we need to have the same conversation with Facebook and Twitter and all these different platforms. And I think at this point, because it's tied to that political realm, the cultural realm, the social realm, I think we're not really getting that story. And I'm not super convinced that them being on TikTok is going to help all that much. I think that would be a very much complicated process. But I think certainly asking them to talk to the people, to their constituents, to the people who are kind of part of these systems. I really, frankly, don't need to hear from the people who run TikTok to understand this better. I need to talk to people who use it, who are part of it, who are kind of the ones who would be impacted by this, because I think that ultimately it's their lives and livelihoods that I think should matter and that should spark deeper conversations about the issue.
Well, Miles, thank you so much for talking with me about this today. Obviously, we'll see if it actually takes place tomorrow on the floor. What happens if tomorrow doesn't go through as they report it perhaps will, then we'll be back, talking about probably what the next ban could possibly look like, whether, state-wise or nationally.
Yeah, I think at the very least, certainly, like, if it passes the House, that's one thing, but the Senate will be more complicated. I think it kind of brings it up to a different point of conversation. I think right now, it's kind of Republican leadership pushing this out of the House. When you go to the Democrat-controlled Senate, it kind of, I think, becomes a little bit more difficult to figure that out. And I think the longer we keep talking about it, the more kind of the risk of alienating young voters has to be a part of the conversation, in terms of how people are going to respond to this and what it says about the political establishment's connection to their lives. So I think that the deeper we get into the conversation, the more likely it becomes that this kind of goes the way of what happened in 2016. But at the same time, it's an important conversation to be having. So I'm happy to have it.
Thank you so much. And yeah, in the lead up to the election, we'll have to see what happens on all of those different social sites. But again, thank you, Miles, so much for joining us. If you're tuning in, feel free to check out the link if you're on Facebook or if you're on WAVY.com. There's some back history and some more information and tagged links to find out more about this. But Miles, thank you again for joining us today.
Thanks, Sarah.